Great. So thank you, everyone, for coming out here. Thank you for the welcome to the department, as I just started a week ago. Thank you, Brecht, for organizing everything. So today I am going to discuss marginalization and dependency. Some of the slide looks like it got cut off. That's okay. From North African perspectives. So next slide. Both in the origins of the marginalization literature are actually in Latin American dependency theory. It was used very empirically all over because of the nature of the word, but it started to be used a little more systematically, especially in the 1960s and 70s, to talk about Peru and processes of exclusion in some way or another, impoverishment, immiseration, and so forth. And on the other side of the coin, you would also have a tendency, I think, in dependency theory in both Latin America and as it entered the Arab region, particularly Tunisia and Algeria, to actually use it descriptively rather than theoretically. That is, they would say a country would be dependent. A country would be dependent on North America because it imported cereal. Therefore, there was a dependence, right? Which is actually just kind of a literal meaning to describe empirical phenomenon rather than what we could call a theorization of the actual concept that we are seeking to understand. So I think it's, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, even though, of course, at the theoretical level, they constitute one another in a certain sense. But at the empirical level, there would just be, there's extensive descriptions, which are very valuable, of situations of dependency characterized by a number of indicators of flows, or situations of marginalization characterized by underdevelopment indicators like poverty, like underdeveloped housing, like living in slums, like inadequate infrastructure, and so forth. So what I want to do is to put forth some theorizations that offered theoretical clarity as to how to deploy some of these terms. Enrique Dussel, before he became a kind of a liberation theology priest, was actually was doing some of the most original third world rereadings of Marx starting in the 1980s, 1990s, and was doing extensive rereadings of both Marx and an imminent critique of specifically Latin American dependency theory itself, precisely along the lines that I was just outlining and really repeating from him, which is that the dependency theretofore had been more about describing empirical phenomena and characterizing them as dependency, rather than starting with a concept of dependency and using that to actually bring light onto a set of processes. So what he pointed out is that dependency was simply the transfer of surplus value from dominated national capital, a national capital space that is a set of farms, corporations, and so forth that were headquartered in a specific political entity and that were constituted by the hard barrier of post-colonial state formation, set of laws, set of labor legislations, and so forth. There was a transfer of value from that space to dominating space, that is generally south-north transfer. And that an element of that surplus transfer, although not the deciding element that would characterize it, was the low wages. And this is what Marini characterized as super exploitation. So low wages allowing for the transfer of value through wage differentials exceeding productivity differentials. Samir Amin, went on to point out that one of the major things that we could characterize as the distinction between the core, that is the dominating national capital space, and the periphery, that is the dominated national capital space, was the entire political engineering of the society to maintain low wages. So that, in fact, almost everything about that society, if we wanted to actually understand it, would not be trying to understand, if we really wanted to understand kind of its structural anatomy, would be trying to understand not how it came to be, for example, importing cereal from the United States, or how it came to be relying on technology from Europe or the United States, but that we basically needed to understand how it was that it was organized to suppress wages And a major element of that was, of course, maintaining very large labor reservoirs. And the low wages and the presence of a labor reservoir that is made up of a series of types of structural semi-employment or unemployment or underemployment. And these are, I think, what we really are talking about very often, but not always when we talk about marginalization. It was these phenomena that then would produce, combine to produce a low supply price for the commodities that would export from the periphery and then produce the phenomena of the value flow, because a low supply price for commodities means for coming from the periphery will go alongside with a high supply price for commodities coming from the core, produce imbalanced flows of value, and would produce the domination of one social formation over another. Next slide. So then, okay, the next slide. Sorry, I fucked up the slide. This is very confusing. Then I took a question from Comrade Lenin. What is to be done? What are you going to do about this situation, right? And so this was also, of course, extensively analyzed in Arab and North African literature to a much greater extent, I think, than you would find in, for example, the Latin American literature about dependency, which was very often, in part because it was kind of prematurely destroyed by continental counterinsurgency, Condor program, the coup against Allende, the military coup in Brazil, and so forth. People became so dislocated from their structural locations that dependency as a school of thought for actually thinking about how to carry out peripheral development was really ripped apart in the Latin American region before it could fully enter into these questions, although you have some residue of it in the kind of evolution of CPAL structuralism towards some thinking about auto-centered development, some thinking about eco-development, and so forth in the 80s. But it didn't really become an orienting research program. So the next slide. So here I'm going to concentrate on one figure, although in fact it was the figure I look at the most and will be looking even more so over the course of my project is Salahuddin al-Amami. But he was one amongst a very wide range of figures in the Arab region at this moment who were contributing to plans and also theorizations around what was called either independent or auto-centered development, oriented towards supplying basic needs to the population. That is a kind of economic remedy for the problem of marginalization. And so what these people were, and this was very distinct, in fact, it was developed as a critique of the prevailing economic development programs across the region that were helmed by the national bourgeoisie, that were either import substitution oriented or later on were export oriented industrialization, depending on the period, from the 60s onto the 70s, into the 80s. That had fundamentally extroverted, that was outwards oriented economic and social systems, and therefore were unable to mobilize domestic resources to supply the basic needs of their population. So Salahuddin al-Amami, who I call him, it's a bit, it's not exactly chronologically appropriate, but he was Tunisia's more or less its first agroecologist. He was born under French colonialism in the early 1930s. He ran the major kind of alternative or heterodox agronomic research center in Tunisia. It should be late 1970s, late 1960s. And he was focused on technology and state support for the smallholder sector, focused on steadily decreasing reliance on any form of external physical or intellectual inputs. He was focused on self-reliance, but not autarky. And of course, he was really developing this work under the late Bourguiba, which was both extremely dictatorial in terms of what could actually be politically implemented, but I think had a certain openness, in part probably because of Bourguiba's ill health, but also because of the enduring kind of hegemony of developmentalism within the Arab states during that period, that there was a certain margin of maneuver for actually a certain amount of freedom of thought, and he was able to exploit that. So this is just some of his contributions. I mean, he started with an ideology critique of the types of knowledges that had been the type of ideological programs that had been the fruit of the state development programs throughout the 1960s and 1970s in Tunisia, pointing out that there was an image of modernization that the urban elite, both the state and private ruling classes had dangled in front of the populations, that was part and parcel of kind of diminishing any sort of value within rural life. This also meant modernizing, that is, getting rid of all the traditional systems of natural resource management, all the traditional systems and knowledges of agronomy that we now call agroecology, and also totally rejecting any kind of technology that had any sort of organic relationship or any intellectual inspiration from the local systems of knowledge that had been obviously developed over some thousands of years through cross-continental exchanges to manage agriculture in a region or in a biome like Tunisia. So in place of the prevailing model, what he called for was, and this is in the late 1970s, was a regional agricultural plan, decentralized and depending primarily on the mobilization of the creative will of peasants capable of moving mountains and defeating difficulties of all genres and living with droughts in order to limit the havoc. And this program could, in this manner, constitute a real tool of development in the rural world. Now, of course, what is there is obvious. What is not there is maybe slightly less obvious, which is that he's not really talking about class, right? He's not actually talking about agrarian reform. He's not actually talking about redistribution of the productive forces. What he's talking about is a redistribution of effort and focus when it comes to development planning, right? So he's actually kind of wanted to carry out revolution and planning when you cannot actually carry out a social revolution, because what he worked for was the state, and he was not doing popular grassroots peasant organizing. And if he was, he would have been put in prison rather immediately. Next slide. So part of this, of course, was breaking with the scientific dependency, which was very essential, as he saw it, to the overall system of dependency. And so basically what he wanted to do is that this would be a function of technical choices and therefore also social choices that would be taken on rational bases, that is rational with respect to a certain set of goals, which for him at least were kind of supplying basic needs for the poor population of the region, while also ending any reliance on external flows into the agricultural sector, and that all of these research programs, all of these traits in the research would be carried out as a function of norms and trials elaborated in Tunisia and not artificially transferred. So very much like avant la lettre, but although as part of the overall critique of technology transfer that was then being elaborated across the Arab region at that time, he was pointing out that you could not simply, that a simple transfer of technology would actually be a tool of maintaining neo-colonial dominance over Tunisia. So he was furthermore pointing out that actually this dismissal of the enduring technological patrimony in Tunisia, including the technological patrimony that is called agriculture, was actually a form of technology, that this was also aggressively dismissed by the regnant institutions, by the powers that be, by the cultural institutions, by the research institutions, and so forth. And this was actually structuring research such that the actual inheritance, the actual bequest, the actual library of knowledges and animals, and how to relate to them, and how to breed them, and how to improve upon them, and so forth. All of this had actually been was actually being actively ridiculed at that point in the state agricultural research centers. He also pointed this out with respect to the water management policy and the irrigation policy, which had actually been the cornerstone of Tunisian agricultural investment in the 1970s and the 1980s. During that time, it was up to 50% of the state agricultural budget was going to large dams. And so he was pointing out that there has actually been a pre-existing system of decentralized, labor-intensive, knowledge-intensive, ecologically sensitive irrigation and water harvesting techniques that had been totally rejected And instead, there was a notion of modernization, and that was capital intensive and labor light, and that this was in fact leading to underdevelopment in Tunisia. What he was instead was pointing out that dispersed housing, decentralized hydraulic infrastructure or wells, adapted to the mobilization and the exploitation of renewable energy and are also creators of employment, could actually be the basis of a development plan for Tunisia. And of course, this was, this is probably a bit more less radical now in some respects, but this is in the 1980s, right? He also was actually calling for energy sovereignty within the Tunisian agricultural sector, but also within Tunisia writ large. And as is actually actively calling for a decentralized agricultural grid based on biomass, sun, wind, and that this should be based on technologies that would be appropriate for the decentralized gathering of energy. So in this way, what he was calling for was a kind of technological revolution in the energy sector, but also in agriculture more broadly, that was replacing the social revolution, which obviously he could by no means call for without, again, being eliminated from not only the Tunisian public sphere, but probably freedom in Tunisia at all. The last slide is someone else who was also thinking along these lines, Abdel Jalil Bedoui, who was often an economist for the Tunisian, the General Union of Tunisian Workers. And he, in line with another prevailing current of Arab dependency thinking, but also Arab dependency thinking towards development, was also calling for a kind of this notion of appropriate technology, not only to be in the agricultural sector, but also to expand it to the industrial sector more broadly, and also to think about the national patrimony as a means, as a real developmental tool for both the rural and the urban regions. And this would mean, in fact, rehabilitating and focusing on all the various forms of technology that have been inherited from the past, and thinking about workers' control of he was one of the people who actually had space to be more radical, thinking about workers' control over the process of production and technological development, and that all of this process of technological development and workers' control would in turn be subordinated to a social logic that would be based on the real needs, using the framework of basic needs, but radicalizing it, of the large masses of the population. And this would be the basis for elaborating industrial fabric that could actually serve the people, as opposed to the poor people, as opposed to the dominant classes. So I'm going to leave it there and pass it over to Lana.
Let me put on my slides.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, unfortunately, my talk is scripted. Sorry to bore you all, but I have some fun slides too for entertainment. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thanks for Brecht for organizing and Soraya for agreeing to comment on these works. So I'm just gonna take this opportunity first to tell you a little bit about who I am, because I know you kind of know me, but not really. So other than being the Marie Curie scholar here, I'm a scholar of international development and urban politics. I deploy an urban lens to think about questions of power and spatial justice. And I do this ethnographically and through archival research with a focus on 3 thematic areas that are local statecraft, social reproduction, and the politics of citizenship. My research focuses on Tunisia, and I'm currently working on a book manuscript based on the dissertation, my dissertation. The title of the book, that will hopefully not change anymore, is Settlement Politics, Living and Governing Popular Urbanism in Tunisia. And the main argument of the book is that local state building is not only a top-down process of territorial administration, but rather it is structured from the bottom up by way of contentious interactions between state agents and poor urban dwellers over appropriations of space and the material necessities that make it livable. And provide all this background so that you are able to situate this little piece of my research here that I will be sharing with you today that is focused on claims making. And I'm going to do this through a moment from the archive. And at the end of the presentation, I will explain a little bit where I am at with this research and how I'm planning to move it forward. So let me start from the petition in the archive. Next slide, please. So on May 5, 1936, Mohammed bin al-Hajj Ali, a 75-year-old waste picker who lived in the largest slum, bidonville of Tunis, just outside its municipal boundary on what's today Avenue Mohammed al-Khamis, and of course, no longer at all a municipal boundary, part of downtown Tunis, actually, wrote to Monsieur Armand Guillaume, Resident General of France in Tunis, then demanding compensation for the destruction of his gourbi. So according to the dictionary Le Larousse Français, gourbi derives from gourbi in Algerian dialect, or qurba, or familial tiles in classical Arabic, and refers in, as the dictionary says, traditional North Africa to elementary living quarters of rectangular shape with only a door that lets in the light, and it's the habitat of unprivileged classes. Next slide, please. So this is a photo of the gourbi in Carthage. And what's really fascinating about this gourbi, next slide, please, is that this photo is that it's actually a postcard. I bought this, I found this for sale on eBay and actually purchased it. And then I found hundreds of other postcards like this about gourbis all over the country in many cities. And it's just a fascinating, I think, find on how the image of the gourbi travels as an exoticized image of essentially racialized Tunisians at that time. But I have more to say about this. So back to the petition, next slide. So the petition reads, oh, sorry, can you just go back? Yeah, before the question. So the petition reads, I'm a waste picker chiffonnier who settled on Avenue Gambetta close to the municipal warehouses. Yesterday, a municipal officer asked me to vacate the premises. I begged him to grant me 4 days to pack my barrack possessions and tools. 2 police officers brought me against my will to the police station. They locked me in for 4 hours. I returned to my barrack to find it a pile of ash. The gentleman had burned my property to the ground. You see, Mr. Resident General, the delicate situation I'm in. Given my old age, I'm unable to find another job. Since you are a charitable defender of the humble and destitute, I'm soliciting your benevolence to grant me the permission to rebuild my barrack and reparations to compensate me from my loss. Please accept, Mr. Resident General, my sincerest wishes. Can I ask you to go back 3 slides back? Yes, to the petition. So if you see here, this is signed in a different handwriting in Arabic, Mohammed bin al-Hajj Ali, suggesting that a scribe, suggesting first that this person was not illiterate, but that also a scribe wrote this petition on their behalf. And I'm just gonna say here that, as you all know, archives do not tell stories of people like this person. So this is kind of a little treasure find in the archive. And if we read the archive ethnographically, this should tell us something about how many of these underlying claims there were that did not make it to the archive. So it was basically an untenable situation for these people. So 1 month later, on June 4, 1936, the vice president of the municipality of Tunis addressed a memo to the general director who forwarded him Mohammed bin Hajj Ali's grievance, and in it he explained that the municipality of Tunis, along with the Ministry of Interior's hygiene services, launched a campaign to clean the surroundings of the esplanade. Nomads had settled on the premises and built a village in horrendous sanitary conditions, forming a new area known as the Bidonville. I know I messed up the order of the slides, so just pay attention to what I'm saying because I will get to the questions in a bit. So Okay, so the vice president continued. This is the communication in the bureaucracy, right? On multiple occasions, several of these nomads tried to resettle back in the same location, including the tenacious claimant of the aforementioned letter. Police agents and hygiene services staff took his old age into consideration and treated him with the utmost leniency, asking him to vacate the premises. He refused to budge, declaring that he will die then and there if his Gurbi were to disappear. The police had thus to forcibly evict him, and after his expulsion, the illegally occupied municipal lands were cleaned and his barrack destroyed. Addressing the specific claims of Muhammad bin Haj Ali, the vice president of the municipality added, "In my opinion, the claimant should not be compensated for the loss of his Gurbi, unless all those who have been previously evicted are compensated as well. There's no ground for allowing him to rebuild, since it would necessarily mean that such authorizations should be extended to all previously expulsed nomads." So there are several questions to be asked here. They're on the slide, finally. So why was Muhammad bin Haj Ali aggrieved? This is the basic question. What was he so angry about? And the other questions. Why would the vice president of the municipality of Tunis refer to a sedentary informal laborer inhabiting the city's edge as a nomad? Who is this population characterized as nomads that Muhammad bin Haj Ali belonged to or was assumed to belong to? When did nomadism emerge as a problem for the French colonial administration? And what kind of problem is it? And how was it addressed? So to answer these questions, my analysis builds on about 1,200 archival documents that I collected at the Tunisian archives. And I did not go into the archives with the intention to learn more about nomadism. Instead, the salience of nomadism as a grammar of governance slowly emerged from the research. So I was interested in understanding the growth of popular neighborhoods in the colonial period, so 1881 to 1956. These archives are digitized, so in a searchable database. And it was when I was looking up words like popular neighborhoods, Gourbi, Todi, and Chantit, and Bidonville, which brought actually very few results, especially the popular neighborhoods one, that I came upon the word nomadism and its Arabic translation of Rahal. And then there was a floodgate of documents about it. And the documents include several types of information, maps of burgeoning Bidonville, newspaper clippings, memos circulated within the colonial bureaucracy, decrees and laws, along with deliberations about their content, minutes of municipal council meetings, petitions by pool dwellers and those who found the site of their shacks in the city appalling, or whose properties were squatted by these incoming migrants. So here I center one of these claims, and I analyze the colonial norms of governing the city, but also the historical formation of political subjectivities, right? I'm interested in that moment of constituting subjects of right during these moments of interfacing with local governments. And in doing so, my focus is not just on marginal urban space, but also on the ways in which that space is made known and governable. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about the methods. I tried to put these documents in Tropy. Tropy is an online research tool for archival research. It basically allows you to import images into files and to code them. It becomes very easy then to retrieve the information and reconstitute chronologies. And this is what I tried to do, not for all the 1,200 trackers, because it's so much work, and I'm still working on that, but this is where I started. Next slide. I want to give you a sense of these archival documents. Some are this difficult to read. They're actually really hard to decipher. I had someone who can read this script, this Tunisian script, help me a little bit decipher them, the hardest of them. Next, please. Some of are handwritten in French, like this one, and the petition I showed you. Next, please. And some are these, which are, the easiest to read, and they're the municipal documents in the bureaucracy. Next. And this is an example of what I said about the diversity of the documents. These are newspaper clippings. These are some maps of the development of the Gurbi. And so this is, we go back here to the petition. So Bin Haj Ali was angry at the municipality who, borrowing Ananya Roy's terms, wanted to banish him from the city. Defending his right to stay put, he demanded to be compensated for his property confiscated by the police, which was his gurbi and all his belongings. But I want to say here that his claim was not legible. It was not just a question of logistics, of compensating other nomads, or of letting them resettle. Nomads were, by definition, people roaming the territory of the protectorate. They were not and could not be property owners, regardless of how they came to inhabit, to acquire the land upon which they settled. So nomadism thus positioned people making claims on the municipality as transient passers-by. Next slide, and the next one. Okay, so I want to suggest here that the French colonial administration conceived of nomadism as a development problem to justify land theft and the settling of French colons on Tunisian property. Consequently, the nomad was a racialized target of development, who, as the archive shows, would come to be governed through a panoply of measures. Triage by place of origin, temporary housing measures that even some of the colonial administrators themselves objected to as concentration camps, vaccination and health checks, relocation to their places of origin, and forced labor in work relief programs, among other measures. So I developed this argument building on several scholars, including Brenna Bendar's work on the production of racialized regimes of property in settler colonial settings, Miriam Hallie Davis, who demonstrates how Islam was conceived as a racial regime of difference crucial to modernizing North American colonial subjects, and Tanya Lee, who tracks the work of development colonial roots of trusteeship over people in need of improvement. And as a racialized target of development, the nomad is not specific to Tunisia. This is actually a pretty universal category of dispossession. Writing about the myth of the nomad in property law, William Bassat shows that the category of nomad emerged first with the Tudor colonization of Ireland in the mid to late 16th century, between 1565 and 1576. English colonizers carried these ideas with them as they set to conquer, quote, the New World, and came into contact with its Indian inhabitants. So the English considered the Irish at the lowest level of civilization, quoting Bassett, ideal following of herds as Arabian men do. Constructing the Irish this way justified English atrocities to bring them to civility, including dispossessing them from their lands. And in 1757, a group of theorists, including David Hume, Adam Smith, and James Miller, developed a theory about the stages of history in relation to property. So the first stage was a society of hunter-gatherers for whom immovable elements are held in common. The next stage was the discovery of pasture, where shepherds had no notion of property in immovables, but in the possession of pastures as long as their use lasted. And the final stage was one of agriculture that, quote, leads men to bestow thought and labor in land, and there increases their connection with a single portion of it. This connection, long continued, produces an affection that, long continued, produces the notion of property in land, end quote. So I'm still thinking about these relationships between development, property, and race, and also about their connection to my broader book argument. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it, but here are some of my preliminary ideas. Next slide. So nomadism evolved from a French colonial preoccupation with people's mobility on territory to a planning problem that tested the ability of colonial administrations to develop and govern the city's edge. And in tracking this evolution, I kind of organized these documents in three periods to sort of trace a genealogy and to show that the intractability of this development problem carried over from the colonial to the post-independence period, and how it carried over, under what forms, where the provision of infrastructure and adequate housing were synonymous with crafting a modern Tunisian urbanity. So these periods are three, basically, from the late 1800s to the late 1920s, where the problem was defined as ungovernable mobility. From the late 1920s to the 1940s, where the concern was with hygiene. This was the birth of the bidonville, the first time we see the emergence of the word bidonville in the archive. And this was a biopolitical, the first emergence of the biopolitical understanding of these people. And the third one was the 1940s to independence, where it became about planning proper work relief programs, urban upgrading. And a very important actor entered here on the scene, which was the Waqf administration. Next slide. So these are basically what we learned from these periods. For the period of ungovernable property, I go through petitions by pastoralists who were actually petitioning colonial authorities about their herds, allowing their herds to graze in lands where they have always grazed in. And the colonial authorities saying, absolutely not, your goats will eat the olive trees, therefore we have to enclose these, and you are excluded from grazing there. And so 180 pastoralists sign a petition to change the forest law in order to allow them to use this resource. And at the same time, we see there's work by historian Hadi Timoumi that shows not the first decentralization efforts. Sorry, this is wrong. The first sedentarization efforts, the first forced sedentarization efforts that came in this period. Next slide. So the second period is 1920 to 1940. It starts with very severe droughts that actually push many rural dwellers to, in addition to land dispossession, of course, to the cities. 1931 is the first time we see the word bidonville emerge in the archive. There's a lot of talk about, there's a moral panic about the hygiene problem and disease spreading from the bidonville. But also there's a very particular reference in the archive that now this problem should be taken as a problem of urban security and not urbanism, right? Of security and not urbanism. There were decrees then to start demolitions, to have people pay for the demolitions, to control this commission carnet de transhumance is a checkbook for their mobility over the territory. None of these things actually worked. Next slide. And the last period is these eviction policies that were logistically very demanding, and then work relief programs and food subsidies meant to keep people in place, and then housing in resettlement zones and urban upgrading. And this is where the Waqf intervenes. And I end with a petition by the UGTT, by the workers' union, who's speaking on behalf of these informal dwellers for the need for the government to provide them with adequate housing. I'm going to end this talk on a very fun, maybe not fun, I don't know, but so I presented this research at Harvard last year when I was a fellow in the Middle East Initiative. And at that time, Yusuf Shahed was a senior fellow at the Middle East Initiative. And so he was our colleague. Yusuf Shahed was, for those who don't know, the prime minister in Tunisia, and he is the longest standing prime minister in power. He stayed in power for 2.5 years. Anyway, Yusuf Shahed happened to be at my presentation. I think Tariq Masoud, our boss then, was like, you must come. So he came. And when I started talking here about the end, I showed like work relief programs. And I said these work relief programs are the ancestors of modern day precarious labor contracts of al-Hada'ir, what we call Tunisia in Tunisia today, al-Hada'ir. And Yusuf Shahed started clicking pictures here and there, that slide about al-Hada'ir, because of course this was a big headache for him. And I'm like, taking pictures of these slides will not save your whatever. Anyways, so thank you, and I'm looking forward to hear all your thoughts and help me think through this material further. Thanks a lot.
Thank the both of you for your presentations. And I propose we now give the floor for some questions. I suggest also that we take some questions together.
Okay.
So let's have some questions. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions. I will try to say everything. Maybe we can discuss further. But thank you, both of you. It was really interesting. First, Max, when I was hearing you, I was so amazed of the comparison between what happened in the way I'm sorry, I have trouble with memory these days. So I don't remember the name. Anami? Amami was trying to not rediscover, but to give an importance to traditional way of doing agriculture in Tunisia, and to try to rationalize this kind of practice as a technology. And I was like, yeah, actually, there's a good comparison. I don't know if you do it, or I don't know if it's interesting for you, but the same happened also in the architecture movement in Tunisia. That's very interesting because, for example, in comparison to Morocco, for what I know, not in the agriculture area, but more urban planning. Like, for example, also we didn't have any kind of movement in the architecture that was thinking about one and all that stuff, but it was really important in Tunisia. So I think there is something there that you have to maybe dig into, like why in Tunisia, especially, like there was like this movement, like this independence movement that tried to like reconnect with like the tradition, you know. And I was just also, when I was hearing you, I was like then thinking about the PDP after 2011, and I don't know, but comparing to Morocco, I feel like there is something about like some political tradition on some national way of doing Tunisia that was not done, for example, in Morocco, that we already go to. But I was wondering if you have some thought, and you don't have answer for sure. But now with climate change, and because like everything is also so much destroyed in terms of soil, water resource, and everything, do you think that we can like still think that way to go back, or to be inspired by how local community were like using their technology, or do we have to think more about like to democratize the technology that are now happening in the north, in Japan, for example, the way that they are doing also agriculture of soil and all that stuff. So I don't know what to think about this, but I don't know if you have some thoughts about that. And Lana, I have so much to say because it's so close to my topic. So I try to keep it also short. Maybe then we can discuss more. But it was really super interesting, really, and the archive and especially like the way that you focus on nomadism. I feel that it's really refreshing because we don't have so much work on this that link like nomadism with Bidonville and city making and everything. So I just as a suggestion, I think it can be interesting for you to read the work of Rahal Boubrik, who is Moroccan, and he's working specifically on Rahal in Morocco, and he has a book, De la tente à la ville. So I think that can be interesting also for you. And one of the thing that the question that I have, so you said that because they were nomad, that they created this category, so they were not entitled to property. So I was wondering, do you think that is in some way like inspired by the Ottoman law, because this is also what happened in the Naqab. So I don't know if you also make like a comparison in the Naqab and the way that Israeli disposes the Naqab. So this is the law in Palestine, the Naqab population, and there's a lot of work that have been done. So maybe also that there is something that you can compare, like in terms of theory and literature. I would just, otherwise I would talk too much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Soraya. Another question? Kun?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question about this concept of nomadism in the sense that so the French came up with the name, and I suppose was the. I mean, you talked about these people contesting destruction of their homes, but was the naming of them as nomads also contested by them? Because I see the politics in naming them nomads precisely not to link them to property or some kind of property claim. So how did that? I mean, they must be aware of being named nomads, right?
Yeah.
Was there some kind of contestation?
Yeah.
So you can add something also
Yeah.
to this. Also, I think that it will be amazing, but I know that it's maybe too much and not possible also in terms of work. But what's happening in Libya now, it's really about that, because they are really trying to make a legislation to see who can own what, and like in terms of tribe and nomadism, there is really something happening now, like actually in Tunisia, because they don't know how to divide land and they don't know who owns what in terms of. So I
Maybe we can answer that and then take more questions. What do you think?
I had a question myself also,
Okay.
so I would also like to pose a question, and they are very brief.
Okay.
So first for you, Lana, when I read and hear your conclusions, I immediately have to think also about how this process happened in the West. And here, for example, in the city of Ghent, the whole hygiene movement, the problem with the slums, with the working class here. We had the World Exposition just before the First World War, and there had to be a lot of resettlements over there. So to which extent is this a colonial issue, and to which extent is this just a class issue, or to which extent are those two linked, interconnected with one another? And Max, your talk invited me to further think on the specific types of modernization, also in Gramsci's sense of passive revolution, because there is a tension there. There are things that are being proposed, there are radical things that are being proposed, but they are a way of circumventing the issue or the absence of popular power, of popular mobilization. So to which extent is this a kind of alternative capitalist modernization that is being proposed, or to which extent does this already break a bit out of the structure of capitalism?
I have a question for Matt. Oh,
I just have one remark, so it's so you can answer everything. I was thinking, so this is not my topic at all. Racialization is more my topic, but I was thinking, so next to my family house in Tunis, there's a land that.
where is the house?
It's in Jardin del Mazar. So,
Okay.
So and it's a new area that is being built, but it's already owned by those super mega rich promoters. That, But there's a family of nomads, and they're called Graba. So I never made the link, that are being exposed from the land over and over again. And AIFH, Agence Foncière de l'Habitat, has given them a resettlement opportunity, and then of course a building, like an apartment where they do not have, for example, farm animals, which they they always travel with farm animals. But yeah, my question, I guess, is do you know what happened to the forms of nomadism that have survived in Tunisia or elsewhere today? Yeah. So yeah.
I'll suggest you start answering, and maybe we can take another round of questions afterwards.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you both for these questions. So this question about, I know that they were there, this whole vernacular and grassroots and appropriate was a worldwide movement at that time, right, in the late 70s and early 80s. So it wasn't, I think, particular to any country of the world, but of course in the South, under dictatorships, you obviously have different scopes for experimentation in different places. I mean, also in Morocco, they were doing the same work. Probably you know that they were doing the same investigation like rural economic anthropology, technological anthropology of hydraulics, published almost the same time as Amami's work. So they were, I know in Tunisia, they were in a seminar together in the early 80s. There was a seminar of alternative and appropriate technology, bringing together engineers and economists from 1980 to 1982, and then it kind of slowly continued after that at the University of Tunis. So I know that, and I've read some of the stuff, but I haven't had the chance because maybe you actually know better how to access it than I do. But I know that some of it is at the architecture school, which I haven't accessed yet. So I know about it, but I haven't read that much of it yet. It's kind of on my list for a different fork of this project, and I think it's super important, I think, that they were in a holistic engagement with one another. I mean, I don't think Amami could have been such a genius if he were by himself, right? He was actually working with a lot of people who were pushing him and contributing to his holistic thinking about popular and populist development strategy, right? I mean, the question of other than beyond that is really hard to know. It's hard to separate just kind of the chances of history from why it was that Tunisia really went quite far in developing this kind of realm of thought, why there were a lot of people thinking this way. There were a lot in Egypt too, I think. I mean, I don't think it was just Hassan Fathi, it was also Ismail Sabri Abdallah, who was very, very interested at Fawzi Mansour, to some extent Mohammed Ouaddar, and others that I actually don't know their names at all because I haven't had the chance to do the same type of research I've been able to do in Tunisia. So I just don't know. I mean, it seems to me that Tunisia is sort of exceptional, but I don't know. And I kind of have been able to do more research linking Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia was exceptional in really being able to link dependency theory with populist vernacular development strategy. I think this was really where, because you had these alternative development strategies popping up everywhere in the third world, including in Latin America. I think Tunisia was where they really managed to fuse it with dependency thinking in a way, so that both a diagnostic of the problem and a prescription for a solution, which seems to be one of the unique things about Tunisia, but I can't be positive. I mean, it seems that in Latin America, you had some people doing it, but you had a whole continent of people working together on these projects, whereas you didn't have it the same way in the Arab region to the same extent. So there's a lot more to do, though. And hopefully I'll be accessing the Amami papers in the next period, and he kept amazing archives, like 80 boxes, 30,000 papers. So there's a lot more to find out.
He was part of Perspective or
Yeah,
group,
he was part of Perspective, and so the other thing that I don't really know yet is somehow he was able to escape the crackdown. Obviously, a lot of other people were not, right? But somehow he was able to escape it. How that exactly happened, I still needs more investigation. Yeah.
Sorry, he worked with the Bourguiba and he was part of Perspective.
Yeah.
Wow. So the Gadar Nakash also.
Yeah, that he didn't escape.
No, he didn't escape, but
He wrote a whole book about it.
yeah, he didn't escape, but somehow maybe Amami was on the margins of it, or just not as directly involved. I don't really know, because he isn't mentioned very much, and I mean he's mentioned a few times in Nakash's various books, but other than that, you don't see his name that much. So I just don't know, but he was able. Yeah, I mean, I think they also wanted to incorporate. He was an agronomist, right? So the more technical cadres, I think some of them they wanted to bring them back into planning when they could, when they found it useful.
Yeah, they needed him.
They needed him to some extent because they were short on cadre, on technical planning cadre during this period also. So if he hadn't been that involved and they thought he would behave a little bit, maybe they were like, because surely they knew, right? They had a really good intelligence apparatus in the 60s. So they knew probably, but it's, it's something to be figured out.
And it looks like he self-censored also by never actually talking about, but by keeping or by using a technical language to speak about very, grassroots concerns.
Yeah, I mean, like, of course, he definitely self-censored, but I kind of like, he was working for the state.
Yeah.
Like, it was just like, if he wasn't self-centered, he wouldn't have been working for the state. And so it's, I think, that's, we know what he had to, and otherwise he would have been a different, he would have had a different life. Right? And so I think that's how I'll go into your question. I mean, it seems to me he knew what he was doing, and he was working within the institutions and pushing them to the broadest. He was pushing the margins as far as he could push them, and he couldn't push them any further. I mean, he worked for the state, right? I mean, I don't even think he took a salary from the state, but he was still running large research projects and was allowed a lot of space for directing a research budget within those parameters. And he could call for a lot of things and condemn very sharply the state policy, but what he was not able to do was call for a redistribution of wealth, basically.
Thank you for the very interesting questions. I'll start with Soraya. So I'm very familiar with the work on the Bedouins, or the nomads of the Najaf, with the work of Arani Iftakhal, of course, and everybody who worked with him. I haven't made these associations yet. I'm a little. I'm trying to think whether I can bring these in or it's just too much, because this is just one chapter, which is the first, it's the first chapter of a book that moves then to the post-independent, So it's, maybe if I had time, I would develop this into a book, a short book, because there is material to write that. But I can't possibly do everything, but I know this, I know this work, it's in the back of my mind. Did these nomads contest the category of nomadism? It's hard to know from the archive, to be honest, because the archive is not, the archive is written by those who call them nomads, right? So this question is very hard, I think, to investigate from the archive, but we do know that the categories changed quite a bit. So in the next period, in the 40s, they started talking about clandestine, something like clandestine appropriators or something. So the grammar of governance, the grammar of categories around them did change, but I cannot tell whether that was because they contested that or not. And what I can say is that it wasn't just the colonial administration who called them nomads. As I said, people who were appalled by their sight around their homes in the city were like, these disgusting, nomads, ces bédouins, So it wasn't just, so that's why there was a racialization aspect to it that was beyond. There was a making of racial subject that really was being generalized, if you as a structure of feeling, you know what I mean? But I don't know about the contestation of this category. The hygiene move,
Yes.
Yes.
Because you're talking about the archives and how the problem of the fact that the archives are written by those who dominate or colonialists. But are you familiar with the work of Marcus Rediker, who wrote on the transatlantic slave trade, and he's specifically looking in archives that are written by colonialists and traders and slave traders and so forth.
Yeah.
And he looks for methods in order to find resistance in the archives written by others, by the dominating sources. And he has written a book, for example, on the famous I forgot the name, the slave ship taken over in Cuba, the Amistad. And it's been researched a lot, the Amistad, but from the there was a lawsuit in the United States, and it's written from the perspective of the lawyers and the abolitionists, but he looks at the same archive to find the resistance of the mutineers and the enslaved people, and he writes a lot. He has written a lot on methodology as well. Looking for history from below.
So I went to the archive actually looking for that, because I was trying to find a historical precedent to present day claims making. So, because I was trying to look at, today people talk about kind of the same issues in different language, but it's the same stuff, like dignified living, not being treated with hugra or whatever, with disdain, being respected, heard, seen, etc. And so I was trying to find the precedent to it in the archive, and so I was like this, looking for these types of claims, and I found a couple, but this is the most clearly articulated one, and I think they become more so in that sense there is a history from below here, right? And I think it becomes very clear that there's a lot of resistance, because at some point these people start suing the municipality. I haven't found the files of the litigation, but they start suing the municipality for destroying their property. So and there's a lot of commotion around. Oh my God, they're suing us. What do we do now? We have to provide them with housing. So there's a lot of resistance in the sense, but reading it through how the panic of the bureaucracy in terms of what do we do? This happened, what do we do? And also how many times they issue laws and decrees and revise them and reissue them. Clearly it wasn't working. The way they were managing this wasn't working at all. And that's, I was using this as a precedent for to understand why, urban upgrading has evolved the way it has in Tunisia, why there are no demolitions in Tunisia. They do not exist. Demolitions do not exist in informal neighborhoods in Tunisia. In very rare cases, it's because a neighbor who's usually vengeful, who hates your gut, really, and knows people with the municipal police who can come and put pressure to destroy your house, or construction on state-owned land that is done for speculative purposes. So there isn't anyone in it. It's impossible to destroy a house with people in it. These things do not happen in Tunisia, point. And I think this is why they do not happen, because of this history, right? But, this is the, how do I say, the emancipatory story of this. The non-emancipatory story of this is the racialization. The fact that even today, people of not popular neighborhoods in Tunisia are in my opinion, racialized. If I talk to Tunisians about race, of course, they look at me with eyes like this, and they're like, what are you talking about? We're a homogeneous population, blah, 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 It's like they always tell me, oh, it's not Lebanon, this is not sectarianism, we're all Sunni Maliki, blah, blah, blah. And, the whole thing, the whole flood of things, they say. But I'm like, no. There are historical formations that make these people racialized in certain ways, and they are racialized. And the Gurbi, and today its equivalent of the red brick structure is a racialized structure. It's not, it's not an innocent site, right? So these are all the arguments I'm trying to make from this research that's just at the beginning.
Just also to add on this, what I was trying to say, maybe I think you can find it in the archive, and I don't think that it will be too complicated, because this racialization, and especially in Tunisia, compared to Morocco, again, I'm always, especially in Tunisia, just compared to Morocco, not compared to the world, but just compared to one country. But it really begins with the Ottoman era.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
This is what I'm saying. In terms of like the word nomadism. So I think it's really interesting. So that's why I was comparing with Palestine.
Yeah. And there's a new book on Syria called history book on Syria about governing nomads or something like that.
There is a lot
that book, and I'm gonna get it.
Just to
connect
to dig in that, Maybe because the French, they actually compared to the British they took the Ottoman law in terms of property and they just copied it, you know. But the French, no, they designed another.
Yeah.
But maybe for nomadism they got inspired from Ottoman law. So maybe there is something interesting in this.
Yeah.
Especially because of the racialization thing that begins during the Ottoman era.
Yeah. Yasmin, I haven't followed up on. I don't know the present of these. No, I know they still exist, and it's a couple of them. Like you can count them basically in 2 or 3 places in the
And
city.
there are demolitions. You were talking about.
Yeah,
so
I mean, but there now you can understand why they would demolish for them, right?
Yeah, definitely, and it's one of the rare cases.
Yes, yeah.
It's
So
also like when you said the. So Graba, what's the name the Algerian name you used?
Gurbi.
Gurbi Graba. I never made the.
Yeah.
Should have clicked.
Yeah.
It's a Graba. And I thought in my head it's the name of a tribe, like Uled Ayar, Uled
Yeah.
Graba. But no, it comes from Gurbi. And they're in.
I mean, we don't know, but yeah, it's a plausible hypothesis. Yeah.
And they're in very visible and highly gentrified neighborhoods. Like my neighborhood is a highly gentrified neighborhood. It's they used to call it Ras Al Harayq.
Yeah.
It wasn't fancy. And now it's and there's a huge resistance because they're resisting any, and there's like the claim of like this is our land, our ancestors have been there before, which is very true. But there's resistance, so it's a very peculiar site, like very fancy, very modern houses, and then you have this land with chickens and like literally, and like and these people are resisting any type of basically putting them
in
like initiative to put them in the red brick houses in suburban Tunis. That's what's going to happen. It's a transfer of racialization. So it's I don't know if you're familiar with the word zarga or azraq. So that's basically that. So you're not black, you're not white. You're azraq, which is the worst.
But you know, zurg is the colorism. So it's like on the spectrum of colorism in Tunisia, this is a form of race, right? This is like you know. So I mean, Ayman Dabbousi has a great in Akhbar al-Razi has a great chapter on the Ajl al-Azraq, who comes to Razi for consultation for his daughter's mental illness, and Ayman describes him as, you know, Ajl al-Azraq. Yeah, I mean,
blue man.
Yeah, the blue man. Yeah, the blue man. Sorry.
It's like a racialized category you could yourself in.
But yeah, so there's a lot. I think there's a lot of work on this to be done, and I haven't done it. That's the conclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Let's take a few more questions.
Perhaps 2 very small ones. One for Max. Listening to the talk, I suddenly asked myself, how much was Al-Amami really influenced by the dependency literature coming out from Latin America or other places? Because what you highlighted seemed to me something that was really, coming from local experience, and that he didn't necessarily need it. The connection to the other literature. So how conscious was this theorizing of dependency, like you said? Was it based on what he read from other places, or was he really initiating it, bottom up? And for Lana, perhaps because I was a little bit confused, we started focusing a lot on the concept of nomad. But when I first looked at the claim, was he really a nomad? And you actually asked the question, why was he called a nomad, and why did he fall under that category? And I presume even in, 36 or so, 1936, you already had in Tunisia a long time a very class and social distinction between the Beldi and the rural areas, and indeed the people who traveled, who roamed the country. and each felt better than the other one. It was like a hierarchy, and you saw that within the boundaries of a city, of course.
Yeah.
And, so it's, I would say to a certain extent, it's more complex, of course, than the regular or legal city versus the nomads who come in and settle down wherever they want. But was there already a distinction between popular neighborhoods and nomads, or was that the same?
That's what I'm trying to say. At that time, they were the same. So even in the archive, you see a confusion of categories, right? Because they call both the actual nomads, for which they have a comité de transhumance, a transhumance committee, for which they develop the carnet de transhumance, these checkbooks for mobility and vaccination and health status. And they call them nomads, and they call migrants who settle at the edge of the city also nomads.
Okay.
So the archive does not make this distinction. And that's why, one were actual nomads, and they understood them as labor migrants, right? They come, work, leave, come, work, leave. But then they refused to call the other ones not nomads, because then they have to acknowledge that they have the right to stay put, right? As long as you say they're nomads, you can constantly say we can evict them. And that was the issue. I mean, again, I'm still working around these categories and trying to understand where are the switching points. But it's kind of amazing, this confusion of categories and what it allows them, the politics of naming and categorization, and what it allows the colonial administration to do.
Because even prior to colonization, when the French arrived, there were a couple of years in the 1860s with a lot of droughts, and then actually floods and this and that led to a rural exodus, basically.
Yeah.
And these people settled in cities, and of course they stayed in what would have been, I think, bidonvilles in the 20th century. Of course, they were poor urban dwellers, but they were there for a long time before the French arrived, basically, right?
Yeah.
So their housing should have been
called that. Yeah.
Quite similar to the nomads who would arrive, or the so-called nomads that would arrive in the 1900s.
Yeah. So again, the word bidonville, it's very easy to trace it to 1931, because before the record from the beginning of colonial rule to 1931 doesn't say anything about bidonville, does not even mention that word. But in 1931, we see it emerge for the first time. It's called that, and it's associated with these nomads.
Okay.
That nomads have set. So this is the finding, right? This is why this is interesting, and I'm like psyched about it. It's like, whoa, they, bidonville, nomad, they confuse them, they do this. Yeah. So that's basically the argument here about property and racialization, and then the development programs, because the point was to improve them, to bring them into civilization, right? And then these same things travel to the post-colonial period with Bourguiba's programs, who tried to do demolitions at the beginning, and it was like, no, not gonna work. And so he started talking about modernizing, pulling these into modernity, pulling them into urban modernity. And the first thing was to absolutely get rid of this image of that precarious house. All the SNEET program, all the programs, all the ancestors of first public housing programs. It was also about how it looked, right? Aesthetically, it should have looked like, a house, no longer, a gurbi. So voila.
Max had also to answer Sam's question.
Yeah. So I think that it's partially a fault of my exposition rather than what you kind of can't find in Amami. So you find him actually using phraseology that's almost directly from Amin. So he's talking about the relationship of uneven development on a world scale and so forth, and the relationship of external dependence, and referring to kind of extroverted development. So it's pretty clear that he was, which is actually what makes it so interesting in a sense, that he was pretty clearly drawing an Amin, and while working within the dictatorial state. I mean, so we can find it more or less directly in his writings, but it's also the intellectual atmosphere he was in. I mean, in Tunisia, everyone who was heterodox at that point was working within a dependency tradition, right? So it was overwhelming in the economics, both the people who had gone to France, because I think Furtado was in exile at that point. And so I had a lot of students in France. And so there was a big transmission belt directly of Latin American dependency to Algeria and Tunisia. And then the secondary influence of Amin, who is the most cited scholar in Tunisian economics. So every economics dissertation, more or less, starting in the mid-70s, starts citing Amin repeatedly until kind of more or less the end of the 80s. So most of, or at least what remains and is accessible and was published, is citing him extensively. He's one of the most cited, one of the most assigned and one of the most cited authors in Tunisian social science on the whole. So although there were also people working in slightly, working from Furtado, who had his own kind of complicated relationship with Marxism and heterodox economics and so forth. So he was definitely drawing on it, but again, it was a bit constrained. So he was going as far as he could, I think, and saying, okay, this is how we're going to end marginalization, is by increasing the kind of well-being of the most marginalized sectors of the population.
Max, there's a running joke in Tunisia that at any meeting of any student labor, someone will say, "Comrade Samir Amin said that." There's like, you cannot miss it. Rafiq Samir Amin said that. That's, you hear it. I've heard it at every student, leftist meeting.
It's a new thing, though, or it's always been like that, you think?
I mean, I'm 28, it's always been like that. So I'm not sure. So yeah, Samir Amin is not exactly a new scholar. So I think it's a pretty steady figure.
Yeah. Good.
When you had a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to this concept of nomad. I'm also thinking about the history of Morocco. I mean, were they called nomads because of the type of housing they were using, or because they were there already occupying land before colonial urban planning entered the game and could start a zoning plan?
In
Because I don't
my
remember that in Morocco they were called nomads.
No, they are. Yeah.
Okay, and then
No. It was the same story, actually. You can go to Sophie library. There's the archive.
No, but then again, the question is because of the type of housing, or
Yes, my understanding from the first, so it's an evolving definition. The nomad is an evolving definition in the archive. It starts with, they live in tents, and there's fascinating stuff. There's like a treatise. There's like 5 pages that compare the tent to the gourbi, and try to make an argument as to why the tent is a much better habitat for these people than the gourbi. Just so you see how much colonial officials were like out of whack about what to do with these people. They're like, we don't know what to do here. So there's this treatise about how the tent is a much better habitat, like things like it has better ventilation and things like that. So yeah, I think the association started first. That's why I'm saying that the gourbi was the racialized object before even the nomad, right? It's that site that was the racialized object. And then, by association, those who inhabited were also, and then it evolves. The definition starts evolving. They spread disease. They steal. Of course, there's a lot about moral degradance, prostitution, stealing, so slowly it starts evolving out of what category these people are. They are sick, and they're gonna make us all sick. They spread diseases, etc. And then at some point they're like, okay, maybe we should separate them between those who have a job here and those who are sitting idle, which is idiot, because these people never had a job or sat idle, right? Like all informal laborers, they worked sometimes and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes according to the opportunities that were open in the informal economy around them, right? All informal work is like that. So, but what we know clearly is that the relocation campaigns didn't work. And at some point you see them, the destruction, the demolitions didn't work, because at some point the municipality wanted to charge people who own the land for the price of demolition, for the costs of demolition. And they were like, oh, okay, the Waqf owns the land. And the Waqf was like, we don't own the land, it's leased to so-and-so. And then they couldn't, and then the demolition was very costly, and they said, people build faster than we can demolish, like literally. We demolish, they build, we demolish, they build. So none of these things work until urban upgrading, which wasn't the municipality that started it, but actually the Waqf Association, with the first standpipes extended to these neighborhoods. And then the municipality is like, well, you know, and this is at the end, really, 1954. Like, oh, okay, we should do something. Maybe we should do the same thing, you know, give them water. And that's when it started, yeah. They tried to do massive housing. Also, the colonial record tells us they tried as ideas, and people were like, no, 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 won't happen. Yeah, but there is a book to be written about this. If someone is interested, I can share my resources. I won't write that book. No, at least.
Okay, we have to clear the room within 5 minutes, so I'm afraid we have to stop here. Thank you both very much for your presentations and for the engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.